She asked me on a Tuesday, not a Friday, when you might expect someone to detonate your life, not over dinner, where at least the candlelight might soften the explosion. A Tuesday. I was standing in the lobby of a building I had no formal connection to, holding a paper cup of coffee that had already gone cold, wearing a jacket I had grabbed off the back of my chair without thinking. And she looked at me with a kind of careful stillness, the way a person looks at someone when they are about to say something they know will change things, and she said, "Are you married?" And I stopped. Not because the question surprised me in the abstract. I had heard that question dozens of times at networking events, at school pickups, at the kind of social gatherings where strangers try to map your entire life in 3 questions before the appetizers arrive. I knew how to answer it. I had been answering it for years without thinking. I stopped because, for the first time in a very long time, I did not know what the true answer was. My name is Daniel. I am 41 years old. I co-owned. I built a mid-size marketing firm with my college roommate over the better part of a decade. I have a 7-year-old daughter named Priya who mispronounces the word spaghetti as paschetti in a way that makes me feel, every single time, like the world is basically good and that I have done something right. I had a wife. Her name is Claire. And on the Tuesday that a woman named Renata looked at me in a lobby and asked if I was married, the honest answer was something I had not yet found the courage to say out loud to anyone. The honest answer was, I don't know what I am anymore. But that is not what stopped Renata cold. What stopped her was what I said instead. And to understand why those words landed the way they did, why she went quiet for 3 full seconds in a way that felt like its own kind of statement, I have to take you back 14 months. To the night that everything I thought I understood about my own life turned out to be a story someone else had been writing. Claire and I had been together for 12 years, married for 9. We had met in our late 20s at a mutual friend's birthday party in an apartment that smelled like someone had recently painted and never opened a window. She was standing near the bookshelf with her arms crossed, reading the titles of the host's books with the particular expression of someone who was cataloging rather than browsing. I was the one bold enough to walk over and ask if she had found anything good. She had. A collection of short stories by an author she had never heard of and was immediately skeptical of. She took my number, she said, so she could tell me whether it was worth recommending. 3 weeks later, she left the book in my bag without a note and waited to see what I did with it. I spent a week trying to decode whether that was an invitation or a test. It was both. That was Claire. Thoughtful in ways that required translation, loving in ways that were rarely direct, and always, once you understood them, exact. We were different kinds of people. I was loud in rooms. She was precise in rooms. But we built something together that worked for a long time. We built the apartment, then the house, then the decade of a shared life, then Priya, who arrived in our world and immediately became the clearest thing in it. And we built, or at least I built, a deep and unexamined trust in Marcus. Marcus had been my college roommate before he was my business partner, and he had always been the kind of person who made other people feel like they were in the right place just by being near him. He was funny without trying too hard. He was generous in ways that were visible. He walked into rooms, and the atmosphere changed, not dramatically, but measurably, a slight uptick in energy, a loosening of posture, a collective decision that things were probably going to be okay. I had loved him for 20 years. He had that effect on me. He had it on our investors, on our clients, on the various interns and assistants who cycled through our office over the years. He had it, eventually, on my wife. I did not find out through a confession. There was no moment where someone sat me down with a look of agonized guilt and said the thing I needed to hear. I found out because I came home early from a client trip when the meeting was canceled midway through the second day, flew back a night ahead of schedule. Let myself in quietly because I assumed Priya was already asleep and I didn't want to disrupt whatever peace the house had settled into. There were 2 wine glasses on my kitchen counter. Neither of them was empty. Neither of them was mine. The rest of that night exists for me in fragments that I have never been able to arrange into a proper sequence. I remember voices. I remember a door. I remember Claire's face, which did not look like guilt. Guilt would have been almost manageable, because guilt at least contains some acknowledgement that you have done something wrong, but looked instead like the face of someone who had been living inside a different story for so long that they had forgotten I was a character in any story at all. Marcus left before I said anything to him worth repeating. Claire and I did not sleep. We sat on opposite ends of a couch we had picked out together at a furniture market 6 years ago. She had wanted the blue. I had wanted the gray. We had compromised on a color the salesman called slate, and she talked. Not defensively. Not frantically. She talked the way someone talks when they have been rehearsing a conversation in their head for months and are finally, with a mixture of relief and dread, delivering it live. By the time the windows started to lighten, I understood 2 things I had not understood when the evening began. The first was that this had been happening for 7 months. The second, the one that would keep me awake staring at ceilings for the next several weeks, was that Marcus and Claire had not simply been conducting an affair. They had been making plans. Not the vague romantic fantasy kind that people in these situations sometimes make and never intend to keep. Real plans. Structural plans. Plans that involved, specifically and deliberately, the business. I need you to understand what Marcus actually held, because this is the moment where a story that sounds like heartbreak becomes something with genuine teeth. Marcus and I had built the firm as equal partners. 50-50 on paper, which had seemed right and even beautiful when we incorporated. We had started it together, risked together, eaten cheap food and worked impossible hours together through the lean first years, and the equal split felt like trust made official. That structure, which I had understood as a monument to partnership, turned out to be a loaded weapon that Marcus had been quietly loading for 7 months. Equal ownership means neither partner can make a unilateral move without the other. It also means that if one partner can demonstrate, to a court's satisfaction, that the other has been acting against the firm's financial interests, that partner can petition for dissolution and walk away with more than half. What Marcus had spent the previous 7 months doing was building a paper record that said I had been doing exactly that. The week after I found out about the affair, 7 days in which I had told no one and barely slept and made it through every workday by sheer mechanical function, I received an email from an attorney I had never heard of. The email was professionally courteous and absolutely devastating. It informed me that Marcus was initiating proceedings to dissolve the partnership, citing a pattern of financial misconduct, specifically a series of expense reimbursements that, in the documentation he had submitted to his attorney, appeared to show me running personal expenses through the company account. 17 transactions, 14 months. A total that was large enough to be taken seriously by anyone who reviewed it. I had not made any of those transactions, but the records said I had. And wrong records, carefully constructed, formatted to match legitimate company documentation, submitted by a credible party to a credible attorney, are nearly indistinguishable from real ones, at least in the short term. At least long enough to trigger a freeze on the accounts, initiate legal proceedings, and destroy a professional reputation in an industry where reputation is the only collateral that matters. What Marcus could do, Specifically and concretely, he could take the company. He could freeze the operating accounts mid-cycle, leaving us unable to pay employees or vendors. He could attach my name to a financial misconduct claim that would follow me into every subsequent professional relationship I tried to build. And because Claire and I had not yet filed anything formally, because we were still technically married with joint finances, he could pull at threads in ways that would unravel things I had not even begun to anticipate. This was not a man who could make things awkward. This was a man who could take my livelihood, my professional identity, and a significant portion of my financial life, and he had constructed a legal mechanism to do exactly that. He had done it over 7 months, carefully, while I was sitting next to him in meetings and trusting him with everything. The clock on that mechanism was already running. The dissolution filing would be complete, finalized, entered into the record the following Monday. This was Wednesday. I had until Friday to do anything at all. I did not tell anyone for 11 days after finding out about the affair, and I did not tell anyone about the legal situation for 2 more days after receiving the attorney's email. 13 days of carrying something that would have collapsed most people if they'd had to carry it for 13 hours. I have thought about why, and the truest answer is that I had confused privacy with survival. I had told myself that speaking it out loud would make it more real, as if the situation were a rumor that I could contain by refusing to spread it, as if staying silent were a form of control. It was not. It was just silence. On the 12th day, the day after the attorney's email, I called my own attorney. Her name was Yolanda, and I had saved her number in my phone some months earlier, after a colleague mentioned her at a dinner. One of those offhand professional recommendations that you absorb without thinking, filed away against an emergency you don't expect to actually have. She had a calm voice and a particular habit of asking exactly one question and then going completely still. And after I walked her through everything, the affair, the timeline, the email, the fabricated records, she asked, "Do you have access to the original expense documentation?" I did. Because unlike the parallel records that Marcus had constructed and submitted, the real records, the actual receipts, the client authorizations, the email confirmations tying every legitimate expense to a specific business purpose, lived in a shared folder on the company drive. The same folder I had set up when we first opened the firm, organized the way I organize everything, which is to say meticulously and with a naming system that made sense to me and no one else. Marcus had apparently not considered that I might look there. He had been in the company's systems for months by that point, building his fabricated documentation, and he had left the originals in place. Perhaps he assumed I had stopped caring about administrative infrastructure. Perhaps he assumed I would be too destabilized to look. He had known me for 20 years and had apparently decided, in the end, that he understood how I would react to crisis. He did not. Yolanda said we had a window. The dissolution filing wouldn't be entered into the official record until Monday. If she had the documentation by Friday morning, she could file a counterclaim by Friday afternoon that would freeze the process and give us the time and standing to demonstrate the discrepancy between what Marcus had submitted and what actually existed in the company files. It was Wednesday afternoon. I had approximately 48 hours to build a case that would either save everything or confirm that everything was already gone. Here is something that nobody tells you about being comprehensively betrayed by 2 people simultaneously. The logistics are actually, in a strange way, clarifying, when the emotional catastrophe is also a practical emergency. When the collapse of your personal life arrives with a legal filing deadline attached, you do not have the option to sit inside the feeling. You do not get the slow-motion grief that the movies show you. You have a folder to reconstruct, a timeline to map, 17 transactions to cross-reference against legitimate expense authorizations, and A Friday that does not negotiate. I went to the office at 7 that evening, after Priya was asleep and Claire had retreated to the back of the house. I told no one I was going in. I let myself into a building that was empty except for the cleaning crew running vacuums on the upper floors, and I sat down at my desk and I started pulling files. The originals were there. Every one of them, each expense tied to a client event or a vendor payment or a trip with a paper trail that was not difficult to follow if you knew what you were looking at and knew the business well enough to understand the context. Marcus had not deleted the originals. He had simply created a second set and submitted those to the attorney instead, gambling that I would never think to look at the documents I had created myself. I worked until 11:30. I had a stack of folder copies and a document in which I had annotated every single one of the 17 disputed transactions with the corresponding legitimate original. I was going to send it to Yolanda in the morning. I was going to go home, sleep for a few hours, and send it in the morning. At 11:40, my phone lit up. Unknown number. The text said, "You should know what you're dealing with. Check your personal joint account." The transfer happened this morning. I looked at the message for a long time. My first thought was that this was Marcus. Some attempt to destabilize me further, some additional move in a game I was only beginning to understand. But the tone was wrong. The phrasing was wrong. This was not cruelty. This was information, delivered at personal risk by someone who had decided to give it. I opened my banking app. There it was. A transfer, made that morning from our joint account into an account I did not have access to. Not enough to be catastrophic on its own, but enough to be significant, and enough, when I thought about what it meant, to make me understand something I had not yet understood. Claire had not simply been having an affair. Claire had been preparing for a future without me for months before I found the wine glasses. She had opened a separate account in her name alone. She had been moving resources into it in amounts small enough not to trigger immediate alarm. She had been building, quietly and deliberately, the financial infrastructure of a life I was not part of. I sat at my desk in an empty building with the original expense documentation spread out in front of me and the banking notification still open on my phone. And I understood for the first time the full shape of what I was looking at. I had not been cheated on. I had not been betrayed. Both of those words were too small and too simple. What had happened was that two people I had trusted with the architecture of my life had spent 7 months dismantling it, piece by piece, from the inside. They had done it carefully. They had done it with planning. They had done it in a way that was designed to leave me with as little as possible to stand on. This was not something that had happened to me. This was something that had been built. And the person it had been built around, the person at the center of the architecture, was me, and I had known nothing about it until the whole structure fell on me at once. I forwarded the banking screenshot to Yolanda at midnight and drove home. Claire was asleep, or performing sleep. I made coffee I did not drink, sat at the kitchen table where we had eaten approximately 3,000 dinners together, and spent the next 3 hours doing something I had never done before in my life. I made a list, not of grievances. I did not have the energy for grievances. Not of questions, because the answers to most of the questions would not help me with what I needed to do in the next 48 hours. I made a list of documentation, what existed, where it lived, what could be verified by someone other than me, and what the verification process would look like, and whether the timeline held up at every point. When I was done, the list ran to 4 pages. I looked at it under the kitchen light at 3 in the morning and thought, without meaning to, without wanting to, I have learned how to think like someone who is not going to lose. The thought was not triumphant. It was almost grievous. Because to think like someone who is not going to lose, you first have to understand that losing is possible. You have to hold it clearly and look directly at it and say, this is real. This is the actual situation, and I have to deal with what is, not what I thought was. That is not a skill anyone teaches you. It is the skill that emergencies extract from you whether you want to learn it or not. Thursday morning, Yolanda called to confirm she had received everything. She walked me through the counterclaim she was preparing. She said, in the measured language of someone who chooses words with care, that the documentation was materially sufficient. Then, she told me something she had discovered after I forwarded the unknown text. The number that had warned me about the bank transfer was registered to Marcus's assistant, a woman named Sable, who had worked in our office for 2.5 years and whom I had barely spoken to beyond the basic courtesies of shared professional space. She was quiet, efficient, and invisible in the way that genuinely competent people sometimes are. They do their work so well that it creates no friction, and because they create no friction, they often go unnoticed. She had apparently watched the entire construction of Marcus's plan from the inside. She had watched it being built over months. She had said nothing, possibly because she was afraid, possibly because she was not certain, possibly because she was waiting to see whether it would actually be used. And then, on Wednesday night, she had made one anonymous decision to point me toward the one piece of information I had not yet found. I do not know what it cost her. I know she no longer works for Marcus. I know that the next week I sent flowers to the office address on file with no note, and I have to assume she understood who they were from. Sometimes the person who helps you survive is someone you were too busy to notice, the quiet person in the corner who saw everything and said nothing, and then, at exactly the right moment, decided that silence was no longer something they were willing to give. You cannot plan for that kind of help. You can only recognize it when it arrives and decide what you're going to do with the time it buys you. Friday arrived. Yolanda filed the counterclaim at 10 in the morning. By noon, the dissolution process was frozen. The Monday filing could not proceed while the counterclaim was under review. By 3 in the afternoon, Marcus's attorney had called Yolanda to discuss the possibility of a structured settlement conversation. The call itself was short, and Yolanda relayed it to me simply. Marcus's attorney said they were open to exploring alternatives. What that meant, translated from attorney into plain language, was that Marcus had looked at the documentation I had reconstructed and realized the fabricated records could now be compared, line by line and date by date, against the originals, which meant the misconduct claim, the entire foundation of his dissolution filing, was now demonstrably false in a way that could be proven in a proceeding. Which meant the strategy had failed, and the cost of continuing to pursue it had increased substantially, and alternatives was the word you used when you needed to find a way out that did not look like retreat. The settlement process took 6 weeks. 6 weeks of attorneys and mediators and conference rooms that all looked the same and smelled faintly of recycled air. 6 weeks of sitting on the opposite side of a table from a man I had known for 20 years, watching him understand, incrementally, that the plan had not worked. I want to be precise about what I mean when I say I won. I did not win the company. We dissolved the partnership, and the dissolution was structured to reflect the actual ownership of the client relationships and the legitimate financials, which meant I walked away without the infrastructure we had built together, the office, the staff, the operating systems, and with only what was demonstrably mine, which cost me years of work and a significant amount of money. What I won was the record, the actual, official, documented record of who had done what to whom. Marcus left with a settlement agreement that did not say, anywhere in it, that I had committed financial misconduct. It said the partnership had been dissolved. That is all it said. And in an industry where the record is the reputation, the difference between those two things is everything. The afternoon the settlement was signed, I drove to pick up Priya from school. She came out of the building with a drawing she had made in art class. A house with a lopsided chimney and a figure in the yard she said was supposed to be me. I asked how she knew it was me. She said, "Because he's the tallest." I put the drawing on the dashboard and drove home. Claire and I had the kind of conversations that happen after the performing is over. Not in one sitting. Over weeks and months, and the hours between Priya's bedtime and the point at which the silence became too heavy to be useful. We had the conversation that two people have when they stop trying to manage each other's perception and just say what is true. Some of what Claire said was hard to hear. Some of it was clarifying in ways I had not expected. She had loved Marcus. She did not say she had not loved me. She said something more complicated and more painful, that she had spent years feeling invisible inside our shared life. That she had tried, in ways I had either missed or not registered, to say this, that she had eventually stopped trying to say it and had instead moved toward the first person who seemed to see her. I sat with that for a long time, not accepting it as an excuse. It was not an excuse, and she did not offer it as one, but trying to understand it as information, as something true that had been true while I was not looking. I had been busy. I had been building something. I had treated our life together as something that did not need tending because it had been tended so far, and I did not see why that would change. You do not have to be a villain to let something die from inattention. You just have to be someone who stopped looking at it. We separated, formally, carefully, with the specific tenderness of two people who had made something real together and did not want to reduce it to a legal process, even though a legal process was exactly what it also was. We made a decision early on, earlier than either of us expected to make it, that Priya would be the organizing principle of every choice. Not what was easier for us, not what was less painful. What kept Priya as centered and as stable as two disrupted people could manage. That choice was hard. It remains hard. It requires, regularly, that both of us do things we would rather not do. It requires a considered kindness that we have not always managed and have always returned to, because the alternative is a child who watches her parents fail at the most basic thing and learns that this is how people treat each other when things get difficult. Priya still mispronounces spaghetti. Every time she does it, I look at her across the dinner table and think, whatever else happened, this is exactly right. I left the firm. That sentence is simpler than what it was. Leaving something you built over 11 years, leaving the physical space of it, the habits of it, the colleagues and the clients, and the particular satisfaction of a specific kind of work you have gotten very good at, is not like changing jobs. It is more like changing species. You are still recognizably yourself, but the environment you evolved for is gone, and you have to figure out whether you can adapt or whether you are just going to be wrong for wherever you are now. I adapted. More slowly than I would have liked. For the first several months, I took freelance clients on a project basis, working out of coffee shops and libraries and the kitchen table after Priya went to school. The income was erratic. The hours were strange. I spent more time alone than I had spent in a decade. But I was building something that was entirely mine. Not 50-50. Not split down the middle by an agreement that had been designed for a version of trust that no longer existed. Mine. By the end of the year, I had enough steady work to bring on a contractor. By spring, I had 2. By the following autumn, we were 3, plus a part-time operations person who kept us organized. Small, deliberate, Nothing like the scale of what I had left behind, but clean and mine, and built without any architecture I hadn't put there myself. It was during this time, the year of rebuilding, the year of coffee shops and early mornings, and the particular freedom of having nothing to protect that you hadn't chosen to hold, that I found the lobby. I cannot explain why I liked it. It was a lobby, office building, not particularly distinguished. Good coffee shop on the ground floor. Afternoon light that came through the west-facing windows at an angle that made the whole space feel, for a few hours each day, like something worth sitting in. Nobody there knew who I had been before. Nobody was watching me for signs of how I was handling things. I was just a person with a laptop and a cold cup of coffee, doing work. I had been going there for 3 months when I first noticed Renata. She was not trying to be noticed. She was always working, laptop open, one earphone in. The particular posture of someone who has made themselves genuinely comfortable in a shared space, without taking up more than their portion of it. She had dark hair she wore in a loose knot, and a habit of reading something on her phone with her head tilted slightly to the left, like she was deciding whether to believe it. We acknowledged each other the way regulars do, a small nod, an adjustment of posture that means I see you, I'm not a threat, we can both be here, for several weeks before we spoke. The first occasion was practical. Her laptop battery died, and I had a charger that fit. That was the entire event. She said, "Thank you. You've saved me." I said, "Not yet. Let's see if the charger actually works first." It did. She laughed. It was a real laugh, not the polite kind. We talked occasionally after that. The way people talk when they are circling something neither of them has quite named. She told me she was a landscape architect. She designed parks and public spaces and community gardens, and she had a particular interest in what she called threshold spaces, the places between environments, where one kind of place becomes another. Shorelines, the edge of a park where it meets a sidewalk, the moment where a neighborhood changes character from one block to the next. She said most people move through them without stopping to notice where they were. I said I thought I had spent a long time not noticing which side of the threshold I was standing on. She looked at me with the attention that careful people give to things they find genuinely interesting, and she did not ask what I meant. She just nodded, once, the way someone nods when they recognize something without needing it explained. A month passed. Then, another. She told me about a difficult client who kept changing the specifications for a park design after the plans were already in progress. I told her about a campaign I had been certain would work that had completely failed to land. The conversations were easy in a way I had forgotten conversations could be easy. Not because everything was simple between us, but because neither of us was performing anything. Neither of us was managing the other's impression. We were just two people talking honestly about the work we did, and occasionally, lightly, about the lives around the work. And then on a Tuesday, in the lobby, with my coffee going cold in my hand, she looked at me with that particular stillness and said, "Are you married?" I stopped, because I knew what she was asking. She had been in that lobby long enough to see the outline of my life. She knew I had a daughter. She knew the firm I'd been running had recently changed shape. She knew I'd had a year that had rearranged things. She wasn't asking the legal question. She was asking the real question, the one underneath, the one that only a person who has paid careful attention would know to ask. Are you still in it? Are you carrying it with you? Is there room for something else, or are you a person who is still defined by a thing that has already ended? I looked at her for a long moment. I thought about the 12 years. I thought about the wine glasses. I thought about sitting at the kitchen table at 3 in the morning, making a list while the rest of my life slept in the same house. I thought about the 48 hours. I thought about Yolanda's one question. I thought about Sable and the flowers and the unknown number. I thought about 6 weeks of conference rooms. I thought about the afternoon with the drawing on the dashboard. I thought about Priya saying Paschetti at dinner and looking at me with total confidence that the world made sense and that I was a person she could rely on. And then I said the truest thing I could find. I was. I think I'm figuring out what I am now. Renata was quiet for 3 full seconds. Then she said, "That's a better answer than most people give when they already know the real answer." We had coffee that afternoon at the place around the corner. Real coffee, in chairs that were not designed for working, with no laptops open. We talked for 2 hours. I told her more than I expected to. Not everything. Some things take longer to tell, but more than I had told most people in the 14 months between that night and that Tuesday. She told me things that surprised me. She had her own years she didn't talk about much. Different shape, same species. The kind of year that teaches you, against your will, what you are actually made of. When we finally stood to leave, she said, "Same time next week?" I said yes. I do not know, as I write this, where that story goes. I know where the other story went. The one with the wine glasses and the attorney's email and the 48 hours, and I know that it ended with a clean record, a smaller firm, and a life that fits me better than the larger one did. Even though the larger one is what I had spent a decade building, I know that I am a better father in this smaller life than I was in the previous one. Not because I try harder, though I do, but because I am more present in it. I am not distracted by a partnership that needed constant management. I am not running at the pace that ambition sets when it is untethered from anything it actually means. I have dinner with Priya 4 nights a week, and I am actually at dinner, not partially elsewhere. I know that Marcus is running a smaller firm in a different city, and that we have not spoken, and that I feel when I think about him something that is not quite anger, and not quite grief, and not quite nothing. Something that does not have a clean name, because it is not a clean thing. I know that Claire and I are managing, against odds I would not have believed 14 months ago, something I can only describe as a considered kindness toward each other. Not warmth, not friendship, but the specific careful respect of 2 people who built something real together and are trying to disassemble it without destroying the most important thing they made inside it. And I know that on a Tuesday in a lobby, a woman I had been sitting near for months asked me a question I did not know how to answer cleanly, and that my inability to answer it cleanly was the most honest thing I had been in years. There is a version of this story where I fell apart, where the affair and the legal filing and the bank transfer and the 48 hours came at me all at once, and I stayed still too long. And Friday came and went, and Monday came, and the filing went through, and Marcus walked away with what he had built toward for 7 months. There is a version where I stayed soft, because I thought staying soft was the same as staying good. I did not stay soft. Not because I stopped feeling everything. I felt all of it, more than I will ever be able to put into words on a page. But because there is a kind of presence inside the feeling that looks exactly like action. Like going to the office at 7 at night and pulling files until midnight. Like writing 4 pages of documentation when every part of you would rather lie down on the floor. Like saying the truest thing you can find to a woman in a lobby, even when the truest thing does not resolve cleanly and does not make you look like someone who has it figured out. I have been asked since then, by people who know some version of the story, what the moment was, the single moment, when I decided I was going to be okay. I always tell them the same thing. It wasn't a moment. It was a Tuesday. Not the Tuesday with Renata, though that Tuesday mattered. The Tuesday 11 days before I called Yolanda, when I went to work and came home and made dinner and helped Priya with her reading and sat in the kitchen after she went to bed and decided, without ceremony, that I was going to find out what I was dealing with before I decided what to do about it. The Tuesday when I stopped treating the situation as something happening to me and started treating it as something I was going to have to move through, deliberately and carefully, one day at a time. That Tuesday was not dramatic. Nobody would make a scene of it. But it was the day everything actually changed, before any of the external things changed, and it came from somewhere inside me that I had not known was there. I am not finished figuring out what I am now. I suspect that sentence will be true for a while longer. I have stopped treating that uncertainty as a deficiency and started treating it as what Renata would call a threshold space. The place between one environment and another, where you are neither fully what you were nor fully what you are becoming, and the air is different from what it is on either side. It is not a comfortable place to stand, but it is an honest one. If you told me 3 years ago that the most truthful thing I would say to another person would be, "I think I'm figuring out what I am now," I would have heard that as a confession of failure, an admission that I had lost the thread of my own life. I would have wanted to be the person who had it handled, who had moved on cleanly, who could answer the question in a single word. I hear it differently now. I hear it as the first true sentence I had said in years. I hear it as the beginning of a version of myself that does not require certainty before it can be honest. That does not wait to have the answer before it speaks. That is not a small thing. For a long time, longer than I like to say, it was everything. 2 questions before I go, because I think you might already know the answer to at least one of them. Have you ever been asked a question you knew the real answer to, and answered with an easier version instead? And can you see now, clearly, what that easier answer cost you? And is there someone in your life right now who is waiting for you to stop giving them the comfortable answer and finally say the true one? Someone who already knows and is just waiting to find out whether you do. If either of those questions just pulled a specific face into your mind, you already know what to do. If this story reached something in you, subscribe. There are more of them. They're all true. And I promise none of them resolve the way you think they will.